Welcome everybody to Constellations Conversations with me, Robert Rowland Smith, and Nicola Dunn. Hello, Nicola.
Hi, Robert. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. We were just chatting about subject for our conversation today. We had a couple of candidates, and we've settled on one, which is the notion of touch in constellations. So maybe I can say just a few opening things just to lay out what might be the ground that we stomp all over and see where we get to from that. And I think the first thing to say is that we probably are referring to physical touch in constellations, but people often say they find constellations touching in the emotional sense too. So I think we should probably talk about people being touched both physically and at the level of the heart or soul or whatever it is in a constellation too. So there's touching, constellations are touching in both senses. So let's see if we can look at both sides of that. The other thing perhaps worth talking about is I don't think you'd ever really get, correct me if I'm wrong, you're a practicing psychotherapist, Nicola. I don't think you'd ever get two psychotherapists embarking on a conversation on touch in psychotherapy. Because, yeah.
I think only if they were body psychotherapists.
Yeah, exactly. Because talking therapies, generally speaking, don't involve touch of any kind, and some are pretty adamant about that. In fact, certainly in the psychoanalytic community, there's almost a kind of fear of any kind of even shaking the hand with the patient or analyzed hand. I remember when I was in psychoanalysis, the one time I touched my psychoanalyst after 3 or 4 years in analysis was the end of the very last session when she shook my hand and said good luck. That I think was the only moment. But in constellations, of course, touching does happen. Principally, it happens during a constellation, not often, and I think probably different constellators have different preferences in this. But touching can happen, and in at least two kind of directions. One is the constellator themselves might position a representative. I only ever touch people on the shoulder, and I say that in advance of the sessions as a kind of protocol at the beginning. I may touch you on the shoulder. If you're uncomfortable with that, please say. I might move somebody in position. And equally, the issue holder themselves might move representatives into position at the outset of a constellation too. So there's two ways in which representatives might be stationed, either by the issue holder or by the constellator, or both. And that's a fairly, I was going to say neutral form of touch. Of course, it's never completely neutral, but it's a relatively neutral form of touch that goes on in constellations. But probably the more prevalent form of touch in constellations is when representatives might touch one another. Generally speaking, those are, from what I've observed at least, those are gestures of love or rapprochement or surrender. Sometimes there's a kind of hugging when a child representative is perhaps embraced by a parent, for example. So there's touching there. So there are those various forms of touch that come up. Just to put down a marker here, I tend to be a little bit ascetic about all of this and tend to almost forbid my representatives from touching one another, because my anxiety is that it can once touch is activated, it seems that there's a risk that comes with that of the constellation becoming more drama than constellation. So I tend to be very wary or chary about touch between representatives and tend to ration people pretty strictly on that front. And it's sometimes the case that a new representative will come in and say, oh, I feel like hugging them, or I want to hold their hand, or I want to, fall to the floor and wrap my hands around their ankles or something. And I, generally speaking, will say, well, do what you need to do, but without the touching thing. And the reason I say that is not because I don't think their intention is legitimate, but because the impact on the person being touched can sometimes be quite destabilizing and sometimes scramble a bit their own sense of where they are in the constellation. So I have a slightly purist view, I think, probably around touching constellations. But those are some of the things we might begin to talk about, Nicola.
Yes. And I think that I'm sparked by one of those elements just to say, I think it's when people are representing, that is exactly what they're doing. They're representing. And I think there's a difference there between enacting and embodying. So if I would prefer a representative say to me, I feel like, throwing
Yes.
arms around them or going to the floor and hanging onto their ankles. And then that is a kind of an embodiment. They hold that desire, but within the frame of being a representative. If it's enactment, they would just follow that urge without counsel and throw themselves in whatever direction they wanted. So I think there are the layers that are happening. There's the layer of the constellation. There is the layer of a group of people who have agreed to be in connection and to represent. So I know I hear of, and I'm sure you have as well, of other constellations where the drama is higher and sometimes, aggressive kind of feelings may be a part of that. And for me, it's more that I want representatives to just hold it, to embody it, and then we'll see whether the movement has a place. So everything is slowed down. It's not like normal life. And a lot of them, when there is touch, it is often within a developmental frame. So it's, parents to child, child to parents. But as we know, with all of the things like reaching out movement, that sort of movement has to come from the child element of the representation if it feels possible.
That's beautifully put. That distinction between embodying and enacting is right. And I think that's a great tip as well, to give people the I feel like hugging you, pushing you, etc. I think that's a really practical, helpful tip actually to give representatives. I was thinking also on the day of a workshop or an evening when we're running sessions, people gather beforehand, don't they? They'll gather for a cup of tea or whatever, and occasionally people will see people they recognize, they've been to workshops before, maybe they're friends, and as in normal human activity, they'll go up and give each other a hug or a kiss on the cheek or shake a hand or a slap on the back or whatever. And I think it's quite nice, if nice is not too facile a word, to make a distinction between that socializing that goes on before you enter the constellation space and the constellation space itself, which, again, I'm a bit puritanical about this, to me is not a social space. This is not about being mates or friends or, really liking someone and saying, go for it. It's a very different, as you say, slower and quieter space where we're almost waiting for instructions from the field as to which movements to make, where it's almost puppet-like. I think when you're a representative in a constellation, you're sort of almost waiting for the strings to be pulled. And the more you override the puppet energy with your own, I feel so much love, I've got to, grasp them by the arm. I think somehow the less you're respecting that very different space that you're in. But it's quite interesting. You can go from the social before to the non-social during to even the social after, because at the end people disperse again and they might gather on the street outside, hug each other again, we must meet up, let's go for a drink, and so on. That's quite nice, I think, to have that demarcation.
Yes, and I think I'm just thinking as you're talking that we have this unique situation, don't we, where we have representatives from the system of the seeker or issue holder. And the only double representation we have in the room tends to be the issue holder and their representation.
That's true.
So, and if you're the constellator and your link is strongest with the issue holder or seeker, you will have a sense of the degree to which they are comfortable with the amount of touch that is happening or could happen, or because the real movement is happening in the issue holder. It's not happening in the constellation.
Mm.
It's a reflection of that.
Yes.
Sometimes a few more permissions that come from whoever is representing. So I think even from in the beginning, your sense of what touch might be within the frame of that might be therapeutic, or in this case, your issue holder, will be apparent to you as soon as you become in resonance with them.
Mm.
You'll get a sense of whether their physical boundary is quite tightly held or whether it's quite open and fluid. And that's all important information for you, because if you overload the issue holder and their representative in a constellation, the reaction then is to tighten and defend. And what we're trying to do is to allow the issue holder an expansive movement. So I think managing touch is very important. And the difference between sort of touch that is emotion fueled and touch which is therapeutic. There's a difference, because I remember seeing a wonderful example in a training where a woman came up to a fellow student and said, woman to the man, and she said, after he'd worked, I want to give you a hug. And he said, do you want to give me a hug or do you need a hug?
Mm.
And that was a very nice distinction. He says, because if you want to give me a hug, I don't want to, I don't want that. But if you need a hug, I'm open to that.
Mm.
So I think that's an interesting boundary about physical contact. Who actually needs it?
Mm. That's a brilliant distinction, as is the one between emotional touch and therapeutic touch. And in a way, we are, as constellators, a little bit policing that boundary. We want the therapeutic touch and not the emotional touch too much, because the emotional touch can, in a sense, comes from a place of entanglement. I want to rehearse my entanglements with you now. I'm going to hug you because you're a stand-in for my brother, father, lover, or whatever.
I'm going to give you something I need.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think so. We are, as you say, it's our job as constellators to really keep an eye on what is happening in the whole frame. And I think even if we moved at this point to, as we discussed before, kind of being emotionally touched, or I would say spiritually touched as well.
Mm-hmm.
That is, constellations do enable that. And what happens in the room when we all feel touched? I mean, there is an openness, isn't there? There is an openness, there's a connection, there is a slight dissolving from the personal sense to the group and the collective who have just witnessed something.
It's very interesting, that notion of people being touched at a non-physical level that you've just helped me to think there, because there are moments in a constellation where it becomes very quiet and something very profound or tender or even shocking and violent, perhaps, emerges. And the feeling in the room among representatives and people around the holding circle alike, I would say, to build on what you've said, is not necessarily one of emotion in the sense of, oh, this is awful, or oh, that's so lovely. It's more of a one of respect and awe. And it's the closest thing, it's not a brilliant analogy, I would liken it to, would be seeing an extraordinary piece of art or piece of music, or something like a very refined, but not in the kind of prissy sense, but
it's reverential. You don't mind me saying.
Say again?
Reverential.
Reverential, exactly. It's reverential, and it's not the kind of experience that makes you want to immediately jump in and clap or applaud or sigh and laugh or anything like that. It's actually quite still and more, as you say, reverential, as if a door has been unlocked onto something which we rarely get a glimpse of. And it's the sense of privilege of seeing something, yeah, we're now looking into the deep structure of human being. This is a rare moment. we're taking it in. It may be terrifying, it may be beautiful, it may be good, it may be bad. But in a sense, those moral epithets don't matter, because what we're being given is a glimpse into an underlying reality. And that's what's touching us. And to use, I'm building on your distinction between emotional and therapeutic touch, really. It's not emotional in the sense that we're being touched there. It is closer to spiritual. I'm hesitant about that word. It's slightly aesthetic even, but it happens at a profounder level, a truth level. Again, getting into deep water here, but a truth level rather than a feeling level.
Yes, it's a moment of meaning.
Yes.
Shared meaning, even if that meaning is slightly different for every person present. And often, I mean, I've seen more of the sort of elevated ones than you described, the moments of violence, but there's a recognition that this is a deep moment, and that it's really quite iconic, that all of our families will have some kind of resonance of this, whether it's about loss, whether it's about being reunited, whether it's about understanding. And I think, as you said, rather than all leaning forward, we all sort of step back and make the field a little bit more spacious somehow because of our reverence.
That's absolutely brilliant, Nicola. And the word iconic there makes me think that this sensation of being touched when we see something profound is about, seeing an icon, something apparently permanent, meaningful, perhaps universal, but something that seems to come from an order, to use the Hellinger word, that precedes us, or is a set of laws that we're all subject to in some way. We may respond to those laws in different ways, but there are kind of, as it were, human laws that we are now seeing into the engine room of. We're seeing the kind of boiler. It's like, these are the laws of human life. And it's, gosh, that's how it works. And we all know how it works, but we spend an awful lot of time covering it up.
Yes, we throw a lace doily over the top and hope that
Yeah.
we can change something. And so we're touched, we're moved, we are, it's like moments of, if you've ever seen someone give birth or have given birth yourself or witnessed someone die.
Yeah.
Essential moments. You touch something that is connected to deep humanity, and you realize these are essential moments, and that we will, in a sense, those two moments, we've had a birth, we've been born, and we will have a death, and so there is no escape of that at this point. And so there is not, you can try and wriggle out of it, but actually the deeper movement is to stay present to it.
Essential moments, again, it's a wonderful phrase. And because of my philosophical background, I was thinking anyway, as you were talking earlier, about this idea of deep structures of human life. And I was thinking of Plato, the idea that there are forms or orders that become lost that we can tap back into. But now, with this phrase, this set of thoughts you just shared about essential moments, birth and death in particular, it makes me think of the Greeks, ancient Greeks, had this distinction between the necessary and the contingent in life. And the necessity was this kind of force of that which will happen regardless. If I remember correctly, the Greek word is ananke, and it means the non-negotiable, that which can't, you can't refuse your own birth, you can't refuse your own death. And I think that stepping back that you referred to a moment ago is that recognition. So we're being touched by something that has the force of law to it, has the force of the uncircumventable or the unavoidable to it. But I think actually it also relates, and certainly in Constellations, to moments which aren't quite as ultimately existential as life and death. That I think it carries over into moments of acknowledging mistakes we've made. This happened. In a sense, the past, which we're so often dealing with in constellations, has the same force of necessity. This actually happened. You might try and rewrite it and revise it, redact it, repress it, but it happened. And in that sense, it achieves a level of necessity that, I don't know if it rivals life and death, but it's certainly unarguable. And I think that feeling of being touched in constellations is often the feeling of being touched by something that has happened, good or bad.
I like that. The idea that, what is a life? A life is a moment of things that have happened.
Yeah.
And some of them are in darker ink because they were more meaningful, or in whatever way that is. And of course, trying to rewrite a family history as if those moments of dark ink didn't happen is, a disruption of an essential order.
The dark ink thing is wonderful, Nicola, because that's in a sense what we're doing all the time. We're laying down traces, aren't we, as we live, and through our choices and happenstance as well. Things happen, and those happenings leave a trace, and they're there. And we spend a lot of time then trying to wish they didn't, or dealing with the fallout and what have you. But kind of better to look them in the face in a way. In a way, that's maybe a fundamental tenet of constellations. There's this phrase "acknowledging what is," which comes to us from Hellinger, but there's also acknowledging what was, which is profound, really.
Exactly. And what was still is what is.
Yeah, still ramifies. Yeah.
And we sort of understand it, from Jung, etc., around looking at our shadow places. But of course, that extends to our extended family and system as well. That isn't just the light to be illuminated. We need to hold everything in illumination. And it is in holding everything that really we're freed.
Yeah, so in that sense, touch, in this non-physical sense, what we mean by touch there is recognition. We are recognizing or admitting or accepting and acknowledging what was and what continues to unfold, without our screens and filters too much distorting it.
Yes, and it's interesting in constellations, isn't it? It's not actually a cognitive decision. I will allow myself to be touched. It's like going into the sea and a big wave just hits you, and all your resistance at that moment is futile.
Yes, I remember you talking about the ocean and the wind in previous conversations, the field and the wind, and the effects of the field being like the effects of the wind. I wanted to come back actually and come back out of the ocean, clamber up onto the jetty, shake myself off a bit like a wet dog, and come back to the notion of physical touch again before we forget other aspects of it, because you and I many times, I'm sure, will have been sitting next to a issue holder. They typically, not always, come and sit next to us at the beginning of a constellations process, and they'll set out their question or issue. And it's not uncommon for them to feel, well, certainly nervous, but often quite moved and shaken as they're speaking. And you can almost feel the kind of thermometer fill up, with the emotion as you're sitting next to them. And tears are not uncommon in that state. And I'm curious to know what your practice is here, Nicola. I now nearly always, when that happens, when somebody's in a state of that kind of distress, will just put my hand on their shoulder next to me. That's all I'll do. I didn't used to do that at all. I just going to sit there quietly and wait. And I realize it's a kind of decision I've made, more or less explicitly to myself. And I've made it because although I am fairly, purist as a constellator, I sort of feel like, well, look, there's a lot going on for them. It is quite brave to share this in front of a group. I'm the only point of stability that they know of in that group at that time, really. So putting a hand on the shoulder, which is supposed to be a gesture of compassion, slightly of support, but mainly of compassion. I'm not trying to say they're there. I'm just trying to say, I hear you, it must be tough, is one that I've taken to practicing. Of course, I haven't got any feedback from issue holders as to whether that's welcome or not. It may feel intrusive, but I have felt increasingly inclined to do that.
I mean, it's interesting. I would do the same, probably not on the shoulder, but I would do it on the spine, either the back of the heart area, sometimes a bit further down. I think it is good, as we're discussing, to maybe mention at the beginning. So those are the only places that I would touch. I think I'm very aware, maybe for both genders, that this is not about erotic touch either from the constellator or among representatives. It's so the boundaries need to be very clear. I would ask a permission: is it all right if I touch you? But that is the area that I would be touching. And in the same way, it is often a moment when perhaps the issue holder is finding it a little difficult because of overwhelming emotion or something else happening to actually be fully present in the room. Sometimes they have gone back into a past experience, a younger experience, and they're overwhelmed by emotion. So I might do it at that moment or for some other reason, which is quite intuitive. But it's interesting, we have both have our zones of connection. And like you, I haven't had any feedback on that. But of course, if someone didn't want to be touched, I hope I would be aware of it, just being near them.
Yeah.
And some people I wouldn't do that to. I would just feel it feels like it's too much and not appropriate. Might be more of a stress.
Yeah. And there is a gender dynamic, as you mentioned there. I'm not saying it's more difficult for men or whatever, but I'm certainly very conscious of being, a man and a man in a position of power in a group because I'm the constellator. So I'm very, very circumspect about doing that. But it doesn't matter to me whether issue holder is male or female. I am heterosexual. But I have, although I haven't had that feedback, I have had a sense that it's not unwelcome, at least when I have done that.
Yeah. And part of that is also being very clear about your own alignment and intention.
Yeah.
It's a light touch, is what I would say. And there's a moment for it, maybe for it to happen. There's a moment for it to recede.
Yeah. We don't have a whole lot of time left, Nicola, just a couple of minutes. But then there is also, we talked about this socializing before and the end, whether people at the end of a constellation, once we're done, then come up and give us as constellators a hug or a kiss on the cheek or what have you. And if they're people I know well or, I'm friendly with, I do a lot, that's fine because I feel like, the session began and it ended and now we're in the social space again and it's okay to say goodbye like that. Just as beforehand, I feel like it's okay. But I wonder if you do anything different to me.
Well, I'm sort of raised in New Zealand and they're a little more touchy-feely maybe. So I'm fine about hugging. I'm very clear about my energetic space when I'm doing that. And this is about what is a sort of a right movement for the person in front of me. It's not about my emotional needs in that moment. So yes, I'm happy to hug people in that moment as a closure. But it's something. It's also, it has still for me has a feeling of the constellation when I do it.
Yeah, interesting. You mentioned the word closure, Nicola. We should probably begin to wind down.
Thanks everyone for listening. It was an interesting journey, I think, for Robert and I to be seeing where touch led us in our experiences and thinking about constellations. Please like, subscribe, and share. That helps us to keep motivated to be doing these. And if you'd like to contact Robert, you can find him at robertrowlandsmith.com, and myself, it's Nicola Dunn, constellations.com. We hope to see you again, and thank you for listening. Bye.